Hello everyone and welcome! On the bench today, I've got a custom 1/25th scale RC Shelby GT500 that I built a little while back. I'll be doing a bit of maintenance, some suspension tuning, and I'll be adding some patina to the body. Just sort of a low-key RC wrenching and rambling video, but by the end, I've got this car looking and driving great, so I figured I'd take you all along for the ride. I'll post a link to the playlist featuring this project below in the description if you're interested in learning more about this car. I'll also link to the STL files I used to help transform this static plastic model kit into a fully functioning RC car. This body was sourced from a 1/25th scale AMT plastic model kit. I received this model secondhand with the body already being painted and mostly assembled. Despite this not being the best looking paint job ever, the car looks pretty good overall regardless. I do like how these custom 3D printed wheels turned out, and I think they look great on this Shelby. This project was essentially a test bed for a new front suspension and steering assembly design called the FC01. A very scale looking yet simple design that can be adapted for use on a wide variety of model car to RC conversions, as I've showcased on several projects here on this channel. It's relatively easy to assemble as long as you don't mind working with some tiny screws, and it is fully FDM 3D printable, though using a small size nozzle is a requirement. I don't want to go into too much detail here in this video since I've already talked about this assembly quite a bit in some other videos, which I'll leave links to below in the description. This assembly has been working great in this car, but as you can see, the springs are a little lacking in the front. I want to install a new set of springs that will better support the weight of the car, though being careful not to make the front end too stiff, as then the suspension won't really move when going over bumps. It's a bit of a balancing act when setting up one of these tiny suspension assemblies. I want it to be stiff enough to support the weight of the car, while still soft enough so the suspension actually absorbs the bumps. A little bit of experimenting is often required to figure out what works best. On this particular body, I'm using a couple of screws to secure it to the chassis. I tend to prefer using magnets, as I've showcased on a lot of builds, especially more recent ones. It just makes removing and securing the body way easier, but at least with the screws, you don't have to worry about the body coming off. I not only wanted to remove the body to gain better access to the chassis and front suspension assembly, but I also wanted to experiment with adding some weathering and patina. The first thing I wanted to do was spray some clear over the rocker stripes. They're very prone to flaking off currently with nothing to protect them. As I said earlier, I didn't paint this body, so under normal circumstances I would have applied a clear coat over the decals before adding some of the final details and gluing in the windows. It's not at all a big deal though, I just masked off this lower section and applied the clear. Normally when you're applying a clear coat, you want to use a number of thin layers, building them up gradually. Here I just put it on heavy to intentionally give the clear coat some cracking and imperfections, which although very subtle, sort of added to the weathered look that I'm going for. I really don't know much if anything about weathering and adding patina to model cars, and at this time I don't really have any special rust paints or powders, though it's something I'm looking into getting for some projects in the future. I figured this far from perfect GT500 body would be a good place to start experimenting. The results you'll see in the end is by no means perfect, but I think for a first attempt, it turned out looking pretty cool. Of course, you don't learn anything if you never try, so to start I did a bit of sanding in some spots, such as the roof and the hood. I referenced a bunch of pictures that I found online to sort of get an idea of where I wanted to make things look a bit rusty. While focusing on specific areas that seem to tend to be more prone to rust when a car sits for decades, at the same time I tried to be as random as possible, avoiding making the imperfections look too uniform and consistent. I think this would have turned out looking even better if I had been able to apply several coats of primer and rust brown under the paint that I could sand down to, instead of only this off-white greenish plastic below the paint. But like I said, I didn't paint this body, so I'm working with what I got. A black wash really helped accentuate some of the panel lines and the hood vents. Just as I've done for some prior projects, all I used here was some watered down black acrylic paint. My not exactly specialized toolkit included some colored pencils and some pastels, along with brushing on some matte brown and black paint. At one point near the end, I did use an airbrush to lightly apply some matte brown paint to sort of look like some rust or dirt. I've seen more experienced modelers use these simple supplies to pretty great effect. I'm just sort of doing the best I can here. This definitely makes me want to attempt a patina build like this at some point again, but doing it properly with some imitation rust type products, building up layers of paint and primer, then sanding it down, not having to worry about the windows and trim being in the way when sanding, that type of thing. I was a bit concerned that I might be going too far with the weathering, making the car look like a total wreck with massive amounts of rust, but I think in the end it's pretty close to the amount of patina that I was going for. I wanted sort of a barn find look with more patina as a result of sitting for decades and having some exposure to the elements, rather than massive amounts of rot from driving on salty roads, if that makes sense. Of course, in between working on the body and waiting for paint to dry, I was also doing a bit of work on the suspension. Fortunately, on this particular chassis, I was able to get pretty easy access just by removing the upper control arm from the frame. These are some pretty tiny parts though, so definitely keep that in mind if you're considering doing a RC build using these components. On our online store, we stock two different types of springs. Both have about the same physical dimensions, but one spring is stiffer than the other. The soft spring that I have on the car right now is already pretty long, probably about as long as I can make it. So I decided to switch to using the stiffer spring, though I did cut it much shorter. Ideally, I want the suspension to have a bit of droop, so I made sure that the spring isn't too long. These cars are generally pretty light, so ideally I don't want a lot of force to be required to make the suspension move. It won't really affect drivability that much, but in slow motion or even to the naked eye, a softer suspension looks a lot better in my opinion. This Camaro looks a lot cooler when it squats under hard acceleration. Also watch this car drive over these bumps. The suspension is absorbing them pretty well while the body stays relatively stable by comparison, a lot more like the real thing. I've also experimented with putting either softer or shorter springs on only one side of the car so that when accelerating the body will twist a bit, similar to how some full-size muscle cars from the era would. If you're really into the realism and model building aspect of the RC hobby, you can definitely have some fun experimenting with different springs, adding weight, and just experimenting with what works best for your project and what you think provides the most lifelike performance. Fortunately, I was able to get this GT500 set up pretty well, with the new springs supporting the weight of the front while still being relatively easy to compress. Maybe not as soft of a suspension as I would consider ideal for a car like this, but it works. Do also keep in mind that on the FC01 you can adjust the tension on each of the ball joints by turning these screws here. This suspension should be able to move smoothly without the risk of the balls popping out of the socket during normal use. Also, if your control arms are not moving very smoothly, make sure the screws holding the control arms to the frame aren't too tight. This GT500 survived my crappy driving, so I think it's safe to say at this point everything is good. Thank you all for watching this little update, and I hope it provided you with some inspiration to do some work on your own projects, whether that be a super scale model to RC conversion or whatever else you have on the bench. I'm very pleased with the outcome here, and like any good project, I feel even more inspired and motivated to try another build with some patina, hopefully with even better results than what I accomplished here. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.